Good evening and welcome everyone to part 2 of our Preventing Collisions webinar series. I'm Connie Sanchez. I'm the Bird Friendly Buildings Coordinator for National Audubon Society. For those of us that joined part 1, you'll recall that my colleague John Roden, Senior Director of Bird Friendly Communities, chatted with researcher Dr. Daniel Clem Jr. about the problem
unanticipated technical issues. Hopefully Connie will be back in a moment to continue that introduction, but welcome everyone. We'll get started in a few minutes. Thank you all for joining this evening, and we've lost our moderator temporarily, but hopefully she'll be back in just a moment. Maybe it was a accidental click of some kind. I guess I keep seeing more people joining, so hello and welcome everyone. We'll be getting started in just a few minutes. Just wait for everybody to hop on.
And I will just come off mute and on camera. Thank you, Kristen, for stepping in. I don't know exactly what happened to Connie, our moderator, but people are still joining, so we will let that happen. If in fact she is unable to join, I think I can step in, but I'm sincerely hoping that whatever is happening will preclude that. But please, everybody sit tight and we'll get started very shortly.
I'm sorry, did I lose everybody?
You did, just for a minute.
So, okay, sorry about that. So, but I just wanted to remind everyone that we've got the chat open. So if you've got questions, to go ahead and put them in the chat. And I'm going to turn things over to the panelists to introduce themselves. Keith, why don't you get started? Oh, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. You have to excuse me. I got a little phlegm in my throat. But anyway, I'm Keith Russell. Thanks everybody for being here today. And we're really glad to be able to share some information with you from our work on bird collisions. We hope it'll be helpful and informative. Again, I work for Audubon Mid-Atlantic, and my title is Program Manager for Urban Conservation, and I'm located in Philadelphia. So Philadelphia is, of course, one of our largest cities, and it's fortunately also a city that has a really large bird population. But when you combine large numbers of birds with large numbers of buildings and lots of artificial light at night, that usually results in a lot of birds colliding with buildings, especially during the spring and the fall. When birds are migrating. So here in Philadelphia, this is an issue that has been known and observed since the 19th century. And it was in the 19th century that it first actually began to be formally studied here in Philadelphia. But from the late 19th century through the end of the 20th century, most of what we learned about bird collisions here in Philly was informed by a couple mass collision events that we experienced where lots and lots of birds crashed into buildings in one day. And all of those events were caused by artificial light at night. So it really wasn't until the late 20th century that daytime collisions, which are caused mainly by transparent reflective glass on buildings and other types of human structures, those really began to be studied here at that point. And that work was done by our largest natural history museum, the Academy of Natural Sciences, which began documenting the problem by adding specimens of birds that had collided with buildings to their research collections. But in 2006, Audubon's regional program, which was then called Audubon Pennsylvania instead of Audubon Mid-Atlantic, also started to focus on the bird collision problem. And we've been involved in this work ever since. A lot of the work that we've done has been to monitor for dead and injured birds that collide with buildings in our downtown area. And that monitoring has really helped us better understand how collisions occur in the downtown area, at least. And this is important because collisions can occur in somewhat different ways in different geographic locations. So in Philly, monitoring has shown us that reflective and transparent glass is now a more significant cause of bird collisions, at least in the downtown area, than artificial light at night. And that was the reverse 100 years ago. 100 years ago, artificial light at night was, again, the main cause. But monitoring has also allowed us to see that the variety of species that collide with buildings in the downtown area is really big. We have recorded since 2008, 111 different species colliding with buildings. And this involves all types of migratory birds, not just common birds or species typically thought of as living in cities. And monitoring has also showed us that the number of individual birds of a particular species that die from these collisions can be really big. For example, each year we have scores of American woodcock, hundreds of ovenbirds that die from collisions in our downtown area. And last year, we had over 100 black-throated blue warblers die in the downtown area in one day from a mass collision event that occurred on October 2nd. So in addition to protecting migratory birds on their breeding and wintering grounds, it's also vital for us to protect them from suffering collisions during migration. If the many species of migratory birds that are susceptible to collisions are going to be able to maintain viable population sizes. So in addition to the collision monitoring, Audubon Mid-Atlantic has also helped a number of building owners and managers in Philadelphia, especially at universities, to retrofit windows on collision-prone buildings. And this has been done using decorative film, vinyl dots or stripes, perforated vinyl film, used hanging cords, bird screen, and some other things as collision preventing materials. And we've tried to encourage our partners to construct new buildings using materials that prevent collisions like acid etched glass and fritted glass. But this has been a really challenging thing to achieve because these materials can add to a building's construction costs, and they can cause aesthetic changes too in the way the building looks that some people may not like. But when Audubon recently constructed 2 new centers here in the Philadelphia area, we constructed both of these buildings using materials that effectively prevent collisions. And we did this because we wanted to inspire other people to do the same. So last fall, in response to this mass collision event that occurred on October 2nd, in which we had thousands of migrating birds collide with buildings in the downtown area, a collaborative organization called Bird Safe Philly was created to try to address the bird collision problem in a more comprehensive way than one organization could do all by themselves. So Bird Safe Philly is composed of representatives from Audubon Mid-Atlantic, National Audubon Bird Friendly Buildings Program. We have 2 local Audubon chapters that are involved, as well as our largest bird club here in the city and our largest natural history museum. Now, in addition to expanding the number of locations that we're monitoring, and creating a website. Bird Safe Philly also initiated a Lights Out program earlier this year that has broad participation from building owners and managers in our downtown area. And while Lights Out can't prevent collisions that occur during the daytime from reflective and transparent glass, we have some preliminary data that suggests that it has helped to reduce the number of birds that are colliding with buildings at night. And we hope that it will significantly reduce the possibility of another mass collision event in the future. So I hope that provides you with a general understanding of what Audubon Mid-Atlantic has been doing to address the bird collision problem. With that, I'm going to pass things to Adam.
Great. Thanks, Keith. Good evening, everybody. My name is Adam Betchel, and I'm the Conservation Director for Georgia Audubon, formerly the Atlanta Audubon Society. So we are an affiliated chapter of National Audubon down here in Georgia, trying to build places where birds and people thrive. And being historically a city-based chapter, we were kind of doing a lot of the bird-friendly communities programs that National Audubon and other chapters were working on. And when I was hired 6 years ago, I was the first and still only conservation director for our organization. And one of the things that I was tasked to take on was the issue of collisions. We've been working on habitat restoration and native plant work, community science, getting people to think about their fragmented landscape and how it can be more useful to birds. But collisions was something that, unlike Philly, to the best of my knowledge, there had been very little done in our region, and even in the Southeast more broadly. Prior to my arrival, all I could find from my research was one study in the early 2000s done by a DNR biologist and a master's student looking at one fall period of collision. So it was kind of unknown to Atlanta and to the Southeast, and to me personally. I knew collisions happened, but I had very little knowledge before that. So luckily I was able to tap into the Audubon network to see, where do I start? What do I do? What does this look like? What is everyone doing? And honestly, I just started walking around town looking for birds. And I was shocked on how easy it was to find birds that had hit buildings. Again, I didn't even know the city. I just moved to Georgia from the Midwest. I didn't know what to look for from collisions. And on a handful of mornings, I'm finding, 50, 60 birds all over the place. So once we knew that it was a problem, we received anecdotal reports of birds being found on the ground. But again, we didn't have the local knowledge. We started monitoring. I reached out to Keith and other people in the network to see, is monitoring a good idea? Why do it? Is it worth the effort? How is it being done? And most people do find value in that monitoring effort to have that local data, so that then you can take that to decision makers or building managers and developers to say, hey, this isn't a Philly problem. This isn't just a New York issue. It's in Atlanta, and it's in Birmingham, and it's in Valdosta. It's happening all over the place. So we started a volunteer effort, coordinated by me, empowered by our membership, to get out and look to different parts of Metro Atlanta for birds. And then from there, we kind of got the ball rolling. We then adopted a Lights Out program, similar to what Keith was talking about and what's all over the Audubon network and growing, which is really exciting. And then again, as we've got that knowledge, we've been able to expand our bird-friendly collision, bird-friendly glass collision reduction work, So as we'll talk more over the next hour or so, we've been working on retrofits to educate the public and to make existing buildings safer for birds. I touched on the Lights Out program that we have in place. We are starting to work on new construction. And as you'll see here, this is the first retrofit that we did, and there's another one. So we've used primarily perforated vinyl film on our retrofits. And I wanted to share these couple images because they couldn't be more different. Not many places are going to want to go for this complete coverage with the images, but it's great for a nature center or someone who's really focused on education and highlighting the natural resources at their space. And so this is a great way to, it's obvious. People are going to know or ask about what's going on. Why are there these pictures on the windows? How can they still see out from the indoors? So this is some work that we've done. And then the first photo with the dot pattern, that's a bit more sleek. It might be a bit more appealing to a commercial property or to someone who wants it to be a bit more minimal. and its aesthetic effects. So here at Georgia Audubon, previously Atlanta Audubon, we monitoring, working on retrofits, and now we started to get the audience of architects and building owners and building designers, and now we've started to play a role with new construction, just a single building here in Atlanta. And as you'll hear from our fellow panelists, I'm starting to dip my toe and our toe into the policy game down here in the Southeast. So the other big thing, I guess, in addition to all this work is we were a singular city urban-based chapter. And last year we made the jump to become a statewide organization. So now we're looking on how we can expand our lights out work, our collision education, our retrofitting, and our reach with architects to the entirety of Georgia. And what does that look like? And how can we do that from primarily located here in Atlanta? So I'm excited to talk to you more about what we've done specifically around collisions. And hopefully you'll have some good questions for us, and I appreciate the time. So I'll go ahead and kick it over to Kristen now so she can talk about her great work.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you so much for having me on this panel today. My name is Kristen Murphy. I am the Government Affairs Associate for Audubon Great Lakes. I'm based in Chicago, Illinois, but Audubon Great Lakes is actually a regional office of the National Audubon Society. And so we are doing conservation, engagement, policy, advocacy, all this really great work across a 5-state region. So that including Illinois, where I am, we're also in Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin. And this is, important work to protecting the birds of the Great Lakes. So just a little bit of background about me and the work I do here. I am helping drive Audubon's policy agenda at the state and federal level. And this is mission critical work to what Audubon does. We are influencing legislation and working with, the government to make sure that we are enacting laws and policies that protect birds in the places they need. So I primarily do this work by mobilizing our chapters and our members, people like you all on this call, to take action and advocate for important issues that are impacting birds. So what that looks like can be, I do a lot of sharing policy updates with our chapters and members on our priority issues, around a variety of topics, including climate change, clean water, conservation funding, etc. I'm often bugging chapters and asking them, please fill out this action alert. Please call your legislator about this important bill. Would you be willing to author a letter to the editor in your local newspaper, and just various actions to get the attention of the decision makers about important legislation. And then I also plan bird walks with legislators. I plan lobby days. I prep our chapters on advocacy and train them on how to tell a story that, they personally connect with birds and that will resonate with who they're talking to. So I'm here to talk to you all today about how Illinois earlier this year actually signed bird safe building legislation into law, which is very exciting. This is obviously a very important issue to Audubon because collisions with human-made structures is a leading cause of bird deaths in the United States. Numbers predict that up to 1 billion birds die each year from window collisions. And it's so resonant in a city like Chicago because, unfortunately in 2019, there was a study that came out that actually found that Chicago is the deadliest city in the United States for migrating birds, both in the fall and in the spring. This is because Chicago sits along a really important migratory corridor for birds. There's a high density of tall buildings, and there's pretty substantial light pollution here. So that is, why it was more important than ever that we passed legislation that made our buildings more bird friendly. And we're not alone in doing this. A lot of other places are passing similar policies. Minnesota, New York City, several cities in California, they've all passed similar bird protection legislation. And I hope that this is kind of a snowball for more places to consider, standardizing some sort of guidance on how to make buildings more bird friendly. So, we are Audubon, we care about birds, and we know that bird populations are declining. There was a study in 2019 that said that we've lost 3 billion birds in North America since 1970. So this is how we are addressing, just one piece of the puzzle in the decline of birds. And I'm really excited to talk to you all today about how we're using policy as a tool in our toolbox to help make communities more bird friendly and protect birds from the faces that they threat. So thank you all for having me.
Great. Thanks, Kristen, and thanks, Keith and Adam, for joining us this evening. So I know I had some technical difficulties earlier, so I just wanted to say hello and welcome to everyone. I'm Connie Sanchez, the Bird Friendly Buildings Coordinator for National Audubon Society. It's wonderful to have you all joining us. We've got a lot of great conservation efforts focused on collisions across our network. And so we've got Kristen and Keith and Adam representing just a few of our teams that are working on the ground out there, as well as working with partners. So Kristen, you already talked about the legislation. Congratulations on the Bird Safe Buildings Bill passing in Illinois earlier this year. Can you talk about how can we get people involved in advocacy around bird safe buildings? I know you touched on that a little bit, but can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, how we were able to kind of mobilize Audubon's resources and our network in support of this legislation is, a really great shining example of how advocacy works. So in 2020, we actually found out that Illinois Representative Bob Morgan was introducing a bird safe buildings legislation in Illinois. In the Illinois House, and it would require bird-friendly design to be incorporated into construction and renovation of state-owned buildings in Illinois. Right from the get-go, we found out about this bill being introduced, and we were looped into that conversation and able to kind of send it off to our policy experts who are working on bird-safe building legislation at the federal level to take a look at that draft of the bill, make sure that it made sense and make sure there weren't any loopholes or problems in there. And we actually gave, we didn't really need to give input. We were very lucky that the legislation was almost identical to the federal legislation. And so we knew that that was something we've already been supportive of for many years and that we wanted to get behind in Illinois. And so that connection right there, working with Audubon staff, I think is a great first step that can be taken for anybody interested in getting involved in advocacy, is that we have a lot of the expertise in our chapters. We have a lot of the expertise with our staff members, and connecting with your chapters and your staff can be a great resource to passing this kind of legislation. And then later in February 2020, the bill was brought in front of a House committee for a hearing and a vote. I actually got to go down to Springfield to give some testimony. And, we asked our chapters as well to mobilize around this hearing. And we said, please go to this link on this website and submit a witness slip, which I don't think that's the thing in every single state, but a witness slip in Illinois is basically a record of support or opposition for a bill. So you go online, you fill out your information and you say, I support this legislation. And then in the hearing, they'll say, for bill, blah, 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 85 people supported this bill, or 85 entities listed their support. So it's a really powerful way. There might be something similar in your state. But we had 5 chapters in Illinois submit witness slips. And that was really another exciting way that they helped show their support for this bill, along with many other organizations, many other bird conservation experts and groups and coalitions. So that very luckily passed unanimously. And I think I'm not sure if it did get dropped in the chat, but I had a link to the testimony that I gave that we can include in the chat. And that's just really helpful because I think it shows a really, it shows how Audubon talks about this issue. It shows a little bit of an example of how we are able to convince legislators to care about this issue as well. It kind of covers some of that, the economic impact, the personal stories, the connection to birds, et cetera. So definitely check out that testimony. So that passed unanimously out of committee, which was really exciting. And then That was February 2020. So COVID hit shortly after. And obviously, you know, very necessary, priorities shifted, and we were no longer able to continue to push for this bill to be passed in 2020. There just was not enough room to focus on that when we needed to respond to COVID-19. So we were able, you know, we got that bill reintroduced again this year. And, you know, one of the things that we did along the way was co-host a webinar as well, to inform our audience about it, to inform architects about it, to encourage them to reach out about that bill, to talk about why it's important. And, you know, that I think was really powerful. Our very own John Roden was a participant on the on that webinar. He's our senior director for bird friendly communities at Audubon. We had Chicago Ornithological Society, we had our Chicago Bird Collision Monitors, and we also had Walker Glass, who is a glass manufacturer, on that webinar. So very great opportunity to share information there. And then very excitingly, the Bird Safe Buildings Bill in Illinois, which was HB 247, was signed into law in Illinois. So it passed the House, passed the Senate, governor signed it. Which was a really exciting day. So this bill requires the use of bird-friendly construction techniques for all new constructions of state-owned buildings, as well as all retrofits of state-owned buildings. So from the ground level to 40 feet, at least 90% of that exposed facade material needs to be made of glass to help, needs to be made of glass that helps prevent bird collisions. Needs to be that bird-friendly glass. And so it also requires as well, when possible, that outside building lighting is appropriately shielded. And there's some monitoring in there as well. It's like I said, it's very similar to the federal bill, and it only applies to state-owned buildings, but it's a really great first step. You know, it inspires, it hopefully will get the ball rolling on inspiring further action on non-state-owned buildings, and potentially leading to new and better standards across our state and nation. You know, it creates this market for bird-friendly glass and retrofitting materials as well. And hopefully that will lower cost and become more of a norm. So that is kind of the story on how we got this bill passed in Illinois. It was a really great effort from many different parts of Audubon. Many of our volunteer organizations, many of our partners really are the reason that this bill was able to be passed.
Great, thanks for sharing that story and all those details. That's great. Adam, did you want to add to any of that in terms of talking about advocacy and how folks can get involved on that front?
Yeah, sure. So if you were here at the beginning, I kind of said that down here in Georgia, we've only been working on this for a handful of years. And it kind of started with monitoring and with education and engagement of our membership. And I've kind of always had this idea like, hey, we need to get into policy because it's a lot of work, even with these successes, to get one building retrofitted. It takes a lot of time to get one new construction done. It takes a lot of time. And so policy seems to be, without question, the way to go. But it's been very intimidating for me. And I'm sure like many of you and many of my colleagues in the Audubon network, I wear a lot of hats. So I mean, the collisions have kind of become my big thing, but I also oversee all of our conservation work. And luckily we've been able to grow, and I've got some support staff. So we have not really gone down the policy road yet. But I will say it seems like there's a lot of momentum in the past 2+ years, you know, with Chicago, New York, and the federal act that's been proposed, all the work that the Audubon Network is doing, the American Bird Conservancy. And so it's given me a little energy. And I will say, if you are in an Audubon chapter, and maybe one with fewer staff or even a volunteer run chapter who's interested, we were able to engage a local university. So we worked with Georgia Tech this past year, and they actually have a policy course where they seek out nonprofits or other groups to present policy or legislation related issues for their students to tackle. And luckily enough, they selected the one that I submitted. And so this past year, I worked with a course at Georgia Tech, and I presented them, hey, what are the challenges to pursuing, you know, bird collision reduction legislation? Generally speaking, is there something specific to Atlanta or to the Southeast that might make it easier or make it harder? What are the lessons learned from other chapters? How do I even get started? Because again, I do not have the expertise that Kristen has, and we are a smaller staffed chapter down here. So I guess if you don't have that expertise, you don't know where to get started. I mean, A, the network is great, and B, there are other creative opportunities to kind of get the ball rolling. And I know that I feel a bit more energized and less overwhelmed, to be totally frank, about pursuing this issue. So that's where we hope to do next, is to start going down that avenue to try to make larger impacts across the state.
Great, thanks, Adam. So let's switch gears and talk about lights out and monitoring. I know that that is a topic of interest among many, and across the country, we've got over 40 cities that are involved in lights out programs, and with a lot of these programs coupled with collision monitoring efforts. So I know you all have been involved in these efforts. So Keith, do you want to talk a little bit about the lights out and monitoring? I know you touched on that in your overview. But...
Sure. And I also wanted to say that I see a lot of questions in the chat, and there are questions about things that perhaps we can fit in because people are interested in them. Especially solutions for homes to prevent collisions and so on. So if other people are willing to, I'm certainly willing to spend a little time on that, so that people who have a real interest in this today might get some helpful information on that. But the work that we've done here in Philly to get to a lights out program took a number of years. We originally tried to get one started in 2006, and that was a collaborative effort between Audubon, the Philadelphia Zoo, the Academy of Natural Sciences, our main natural history museum, and we went to the Philadelphia Building Owners and Managers Association. Then we gave them, an overview of what we knew then, which was not based on any, formal studies, but just anecdotal data from specimens that had been sent to the museum. And they were interested, but they didn't commit to anything then, because they wanted to get data from Philadelphia, from their members' buildings. And I certainly understand their interest in wanting to know more about how this was happening on their buildings, and to just sort of verify that this was a problem in Philly. So that's what led us to subsequently do a 3-year study, spring and fall, of collisions in downtown Philly that included many, major buildings that were run by people in the Philadelphia Bowman Group. And we got all this great data. But then we decided to pivot and not address lights out, because we were finding so much more evidence that glass was the main cause of collisions. But then last year on October 2nd, when we had this big collision event, and I will address one of the questions that was asked, like, why do these things happen and what are the atmospheric conditions associated with them? All the mass collisions we've had here in Philly going back to the 1890s have been associated with really bright lights on some major tall buildings that can be seen from a long way away, and really low cloud ceiling, not steady rain, never steady rain, but drizzle, fog, really low cloud ceiling, and the threat of rain. And this is what has been associated with them. I think that there's many more subtle things about these events that we don't quite understand, but in general, it's sort of threatening bad weather, and then you have to have some bright light source. And birds, I guess, get disoriented. They can't see the stars, they can't see the moon. They wind up flying right into these bright lights. We know that under certain circumstances, birds will fly into, like, the Washington Monument in huge numbers. There's no lights on there. It's just it's reflected light, but because it's a bright beacon, they'll do that. They've flown into big statues on mountains that are not lit except by light being shown on them. So birds really go to light under stormy conditions. So because we had this huge collision event last year, we were able to really leverage that to create Bird Safe Philly and draw attention to the need for something to prevent these from happening. And the most logical thing was lights out. And all the years that we have been working on this issue in Philadelphia since 2000, that Audubon has been since 2006, we've helped to raise awareness about it and educate people about it. So people have been hearing over and over again about this through articles in newspapers and yada, yada. And I think when this particular event happened, it was like the straw that broke the camel's back, and everyone said, okay, we really need to change and do something. And all that education paid off, and we had wonderful participation from a large cross-section of the building community. But monitoring has been the backbone of the awareness raising and education that we've done. It's been through collecting data from our city, not from other places, not from publications, but directly from our city. We can say this building that you work at, it that you see all the time. And I think people collect, that with things that they've seen at these buildings. They may have seen dead birds, and then they can put that into a context. So we can say, this is how many birds are colliding with buildings in this particular area. And it starts to become more personal, and they start to care more about it. So monitoring is a really important thing, I think, if you can do it. Another question that someone had put in the chat was about how you find people to help. I think they said dead bird finders, which is a good description of what people do, although we also pick up injured birds. And to be honest, we've tried a lot of different ways of getting people to help with this. The thing that has been consistently the best way is through friends and friends of friends. When you know people, so for example, our main bird club, you talk to someone it's a friend in your main bird club, and they say, okay, and then they pull another person in. It's networks. There can be networks on social media, various ways that you can get people, but it's always relationships that are already established. That's what we found in Philadelphia. People who have already been talking to other people. And there have also been people that have moved to the city that have been involved in this work in other places. We've had people come from other cities to Philly that have been doing this, who have contacted us because they wanted to get involved in this. But it's not easy, but I think that that's been the most effective way, is through going through friends and using relationships that we already have. Is there anything else about that you think it's worth talking about? With regard to monitoring?
I think that's good, because we'll dig into some of those other components of monitoring and the connections to that in just a little bit. Adam, do you want to share a bit about the work in Georgia related?
Sure. Yeah, especially related to monitoring and some of our lights out work. So yeah, when we started looking at this issue, again, we're getting anecdotal reports. There's a bird here, there's a bird there, what's going on? We had some volunteers who were interested. And so that's kind of where we started, piggybacking off what Keith said. We wanted that local data. We wanted that touch point. We wanted to say, hey, this is happening in Atlanta. This is something that we can do better in our city. If you're familiar with Atlanta, we kind of have two skylines. We have our downtown, then we have a kind of a tech financial area called Buckhead, but it has a pretty substantial number of fancy glass tall buildings that we could walk around the sidewalks on. So we kind of set up monitoring routes in downtown Atlanta and Buckhead on Georgia Tech's campus, which is a more urban campus, and then a few other areas. And I based a lot of this off of, as I mentioned earlier, talking to other people in the Audubon network, folks in the Twin Cities, in Chicago, in New York. And I also was building off of Scott Loss's paper. So Kristen did a great job. We kind of missed it earlier, talking about just the scale of this problem, that up to 1 billion birds are dying each year. And that number originally came from that paper in 2014. And in addition to that paper, he and his co-authors put out some tips for better monitoring, because if you hear the numbers we mentioned for the number of birds that are dying, there's a 600 million bird variance. And you don't have to be very good at math to realize that's a huge range. You know, is it 365 million birds that are dying or a billion? It's a huge difference. And so I really wanted to make sure that we were trying to collect sound data in Atlanta when we started. So we came up with these routes, and I think we can drop a couple things in the chat, or you can share the image there, John. We use something called Collector that's made available to us through the National Audubon Society and their Esri team. And so we have an app that we go out, we walk the routes, and we are able to drop a pin wherever we find a bird. We can upload a couple of photos of the bird and where it is in relation to the building. And it's nice because it gives you not only an exact spot of where birds are hitting, but if there are hot spots of certain buildings, you know, maybe it's just the east facade that's getting a lot of the collisions. In addition to Collector, we have something called D-Bird, which is now open to everyone in the country. And that was developed by our friends at New York City Audubon and now expanded by Seattle Audubon, that anyone can drop those sightings. Wherever they are, they can report an incidental finding. And then I saw someone mention briefly about the global collision mapper. We also participate in that. So we're spreading the wealth. We're collecting as much data as we can and sharing it to get out there. So we've been out there monitoring. In regards to finding those bird finders, it is hard. There we go. So that's a snapshot of one part of Metro Atlanta. The blue is where we consistently walk. So we always are checking that same route. Each green dot, unfortunately, is a bird that we have found. And if you were to click on those green dots, it pops up. If you go to the next image, John, a little drop-down menu will pop up. And you can say, hey, were you on one of our official surveys where you were looking for birds, or was this an incidental finding? Maybe you were going to the grocery store or going to drop your kids off at school and you found a bird. The date, the time, the species, if you're able to identify it, but we have unknown bird and unknown warbler. That way, after the fact, someone like me can go through and identify it from the photos. If the bird unfortunately was dead, alive, or taken to a rehabber, any sort of comments that might be necessary or pertinent to the finding, and then those photos. So again, this is all thanks to National Audubon and our partnership with them that we have this, but it's been really great because we can have really dynamic data to look at. We have the geo-referencing. We can go to certain buildings if we'd like to. And then for a little bit of an easier option, I mentioned that D-Bird, where we can, you know, empower anyone in our network to report a finding wherever they go. So that's kind of how we do it. In regards to getting the people out there, it's hard. The good news is normally when people are interested, they stay interested. The volunteers that we have are super committed. So we kind of have this core of people. And I think, like Keith said, if you can get pair of spouses or a couple friends to really take ownership, it's great to keep that momentum going. And we slowly have added more and more volunteers. So we go out and patrol the edges of buildings looking for birds using those platforms I mentioned earlier. We collect the birds. We have all the permits to do so, and then we donate them to universities for their research labs or museum specimens or whatever it might be. That way the birds are getting a second life and helping the next generation of ornithologists, hopefully. So recruiting people, we mainly go through our network, but it is tricky. The other thing that's also a difficult thing is when to monitor. I know some people get out extremely early, but that can be cumbersome on the volunteers. Fighting the cleaning crews is often the biggest hurdle we have in detecting the number of birds that hit, because of course you don't want birds lying outside your building. So they're often swept away. We have had some success partnering with different building management companies to get them to work with us instead of against us. So that way we're getting a better snapshot of all the birds in a building. So that's our monitoring. We're getting out there. We're going in spring and fall, early in the morning, pre-dawn till right after sunset, looking for those birds, picking them up, logging them in those platforms that I mentioned. And that's where we started. We then did a lights out program. One thing that we have not done as well as Keith and Philly is we don't have a great coalition like they have. It was easy to kind of get something out. We thought lights out would be an easier engagement and advocacy tool to get people thinking about this issue, which I know we'll talk more about. So it's something that we could do better here is spreading the word more and getting more buildings involved. But we do have a decent number of commercial properties signed up and hundreds of homeowners as well. And we're looking again to expand that beyond just the Metro Atlanta area where we historically have been working. So I don't want to blab on too much, but that's kind of the structure of our monitoring. And that's what we started with and kind of our bread and butter to really build out our collision reduction and education program.
So Connie, I might add just a couple things after listening to this wonderful information from Adam. They're doing things in a, I think, more effective way now in terms of monitoring than we are. We started long ago in 2008. And at that point, when we monitored, we had all of our monitors record the information that they were recording about what they found on paper. And we actually still do that. So we're trying to pivot, and right now we're exploring using iNaturalist for our regular monitoring as a way of recording that data. But ultimately, you want to have data archived and not just sitting on some sort of website, so that you can always have access to it and it won't ever go away. And there are certainly several websites out there. Adam mentioned eBird, but iNaturalist, Global Bird Rescue, or others that people can have access to record this data. But I think it's always good to have some sort of, archive that's not controlled by anyone else but you, to make sure your data never goes away. Another little thing is that when there was a question about, and Adam talked about this too, when do you monitor during the day? And when we first started our program, we looked at what was going on in New York, in Toronto, Chicago, because those are the major monitoring programs at that time. And we tried to, not try to reinvent the wheel, but we also wanted to look at the problem in a unique way that was best suited to Philadelphia. So we decided, based on what we knew, that we would start monitoring at night. And we would monitor one area by just walking around that area several times over a period of several hours that span the period from right before dawn to right after dawn, because we were particularly interested in trying to separate collisions that were caused by lights at night from collisions that were happening in the daytime that didn't have any influence of lights. And we still monitor that way. And in doing that, we avoid missing birds that street cleaners and maintenance people clean up routinely. You're starting around 6 or 7 in the morning. We start at 5:30, and there are a lot of birds sometimes on the ground. Then sometimes birds don't start dropping until 7, 8 o'clock. It really varies from day to day, but it is interesting. If you do not go out really early, you will miss birds that, if you're in a city, that cleaners are taking and cleaning up. And to that end, we work with staff of all the buildings that we monitor. There are security staff, there are maintenance staff. We work with all of them. They're all working with us to help us find birds, so that when our monitors are out, they will have stashed birds that they found the previous afternoon or something, somewhere for them. And that has helped us to understand more about how many birds are hitting buildings and where they're hitting. And additionally, we've been able to go up onto the subroofs and setbacks of tall buildings. And we found birds all over these setbacks. And to address another question someone had, like how high do these birds hit? We found in Philadelphia, at least, that they hit tall buildings from the ground all the way up to 60 floors, all over. So it's not just the lower floors. There's tons of birds high up. In fact, during this mass collision event last October, one building, which is the tallest building in the city, came to us and said, "Can you please come get all these birds off of our fifth floor roof?" There were hundreds of birds up there on the 5th floor. And, there were many setbacks further up. We only had time to get the ones off of that 5th floor. They were desperate to get them off. I mean, they were just everywhere. So we came and got them off for them. There were some live birds there. There were dead birds. This craziness. So we feel that, at least here in Philadelphia, they're hitting these tall buildings really high up. We will measure the distance that we find the bird from the nearest building. Is it an inch? Is it 5 feet? Is it 20 feet? And we use that to sort of gauge how high up it might have hit. If a bird is 25 feet out, it probably didn't hit, the first floor. And that tells us a lot of these birds are hitting really, really high up. So that's just some extra thoughts about monitoring.
Great, thanks, Keith, for those additions. Kristen, did you want to add anything?
Not much that hasn't already been said with that really great overview. I just want to give a shout out. We have a really robust local organization called the Chicago Bird Collision Monitors, who are, they work under the Chicago Audubon Society, but they are really the ones doing this monitoring work here in Chicago. I think their numbers are, they collect over 5,000 birds per year. And like Keith mentions, that's just the birds that they happen to find. There are many more that are either being eaten by predators or are falling higher up where they can't be reached. And that's over 200 species of birds in Chicago. One anecdotal story I heard was about this black and white warbler who was from Ontario, who was banded. So we were able to track the movement of this warbler, and unfortunately it died during its 6th migration and was collected in Chicago. And that is well short of its 11-year lifespan. So it's really devastating to know that they're encountering these problems along their migration route. We're lucky here in Chicago. We actually are home to the very first Lights Out program in the nation that started in 1999 as well. Also led by the Chicago Audubon Society. So that really encourages the owners and managers of tall buildings to turn off or dim their decorative lights during spring and fall migration. So it's voluntary, but it has been proven to be effective. And, there's many studies being done on our monitoring and our lights out efforts. So, our birds collected here go to the Field Museum. And I think I saw this in the chat, someone beat me to the punch, but there's actually studies on those birds that have been collected because we have such a big, a long period of time that we've been collecting birds. They've actually noticed that birds are shrinking in size, and this, it's believed to be due to climate change. We also have studies being done on the McCormick Place building in Chicago. It's a really iconic lakefront convention center that is notoriously dangerous for birds. And they actually found that turning off just half of the lighted windows during the spring and fall migration reduced bird deaths by about 60%. So we know that these tactics work, turning off lights, changing the lights so that they face downward and don't shine out, because it really disorients birds. Birds see that light and they kind of are, they are attracted to it and they circle around it. And it means that they're either not getting to their proper habitat to rest. They're exhausting themselves because these lights are kind of messing up their internal navigation. They use the moon, they use the stars to travel, and artificial lights really disturbs that. So we know that, they have trouble seeing through glass, and that's why they fly into it. Either they see their habitat through it because it's transparent, or they see the reflection of nature and they think it's, safe to pass through. So we've been able to collect a lot of really good data from this monitoring and these lights out programs.
Great, thanks.
And I'll say one additional thing too. I see a question here in the chat about iNaturalist, and iNaturalist is a site that you can, log information about all kinds of nature observations, but it doesn't have to be a live bird. If you're a birder and you're familiar with the eBird platform, that's really just for live birds. But iNaturalist will take observations of dead birds as long as you have a photo. We just created a project, and people have been encouraged that are not doing the intense monitoring that we're doing. Other people that happen to, find a dead bird, can go there and they can put in information about that. And then the project, can be summarized later. We can get a report about what people have found. So if you find a dead bird that you think is collided with a building, you could post something about it in iNaturalist, but you could also go to Global Bird Rescue, which is run by the folks up in Toronto, and you can log in to that website, register, and you can get information to them about it because they're interested just in collisions. So I hope that's helpful.
All right, so there are a number of tools out there that anyone can use to report those dead birds. So, and I believe those are in the chat. So, and we know that this isn't a problem just in the major cities. You know, although our teams here represent huge cities, you know, it's a residential problem as well. And that birds are colliding with glass and buildings at low rises are the majority of where we're seeing that, but we're seeing these dramatic effects in these cities that they're describing. So let's turn to funding. I know that's been kind of a topic of a lot of questions about how do we find funding to do this, and how have your teams been able to find financial resources to support these efforts, understanding that the work is costly in some cases, so in many cases. So
I can go first if that
Sure.
works. Yeah, so I will say we're very fortunate that we have an excellent development director. So that's something that I'm sure many of you out there, if you're representing a smaller chapter, probably don't have. So we're lucky that here in Georgia that we have someone who can help with that. We've been able to get funding from a few different sources, and I think this also ties back to the monitoring. You know, it is helpful, I think, to say in our narrative, you know, hey, we have found, you know, 115 different species and so many thousands of birds to really show that local need and impact. But we've been somewhat creative. So we've been able to get funding from our state ornithological society, the GOS down here, the Georgia Ornithological Society. They have helped us retrofit some buildings, including one that I showed earlier with the green heron and some other photos. We've been very fortunate in that we've had success, and I should probably stop saying this because I'm giving out my secret, but the Disney Conservation Fund has been great to us. And I remember when we applied for the first one, we were a bit worried because you had to put your species of focus. You know, I think most of their work is with, you know, white rhinos and, you know, ring-tailed lemurs and red-cockaded woodpeckers. And we just said, hey, we're working with migratory birds. And for our habitat, we're doing urban landscapes. And that was appealing enough to them. And we've been able to get a few grants from Disney. And in those grants, not only has it helped, you know, cover my position, but it's covered everything from Ziploc bags and pieces of paper for picking up the birds and putting in the data sheets, to retrofitting. So actually the film and the crane or lift that we need to access the exterior of buildings, or the window installation companies or the film installation companies have been built inside those. We've been able to factor in some cool education and engagement pieces as well. I just saw someone ask, and John, if you're not bombarded with questions, you can put up that image we have of the migration forecasting of Georgia. Someone mentioned Birdcast that Cornell does. We've been able to partner with Dr. Kyle Horton, who used to be at Cornell, who's now at Colorado State. And he's kind of does a lot of this aeroecology, looking at birds in space as they're moving overhead. And so on his website, he has these migration predictions during spring and fall migration for every state. But we were able to get a little bit of money, a little bit of funding to have him do some Georgia specific graphics, some dates of when birds are moving over. So again, this is available on his site for every state, but we've been able to get a little bit more info. And you can see in early October, we had a pretty heavy night in Georgia with almost 22 or over 22 million birds in the airspace. Now, what's been interesting is looking at this and looking at Birdcast, on those days where we see heavy movement, we haven't actually necessarily found more birds on the ground. You know, the conditions might be so good that maybe, like Keith said, you need those kind of lower, foggy or cloudy nights to bring the birds down. On these nights, many of them, I presume, are flying high and clear and maybe are less likely to come in contact with confusing light sources or you know, transparent reflective glass. But yes, we've been able to do grants through Disney, through our State Ornithological Society, Patagonia down here in Atlanta. So some of those outdoor, you know, supply companies, Patagonia and North Face and Keen, there's all sorts of interesting funders that are out there. And then as we've grown this program, we've even been lucky enough to get some generous individual donors who care a lot about this effort. So I guess the take home message is practice your grant writing or get lucky and have a development director, and think outside the box about who you can fund and the types of people, because it is a bird thing, but it's a building thing, it's an urban thing, it's a quality of life for birds and for humans. No one wants to go to work and find 500 dead birds like Keith and his crew are finding on these massive nights. So that's kind of how we've approached it, being diverse and not being afraid to take some shots with certain funding sources.
Okay, so in Philly, I guess in terms of funding, our work has sort of been in three sort of buckets. We did an initial 3-year monitoring study just to establish what the situation was with bird collisions in our downtown area. And that work was funded by a program called the Together Green Conservation Leadership Program. It was funded by Toyota. So we also got money from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Urban Bird Treaty Program. So those were the two main sources of funding for that monitoring work. We had members of our Audubon team, as well as the Philadelphia Zoo that was involved in that study. Some of their staff were monitors, some of our staff were monitors, but with the money that we had, we also paid 2 other people to sort of anchor the monitoring. They did maybe 5 of the 7 days a week. And that really anchored the study. Before that, we were just using all volunteers, not just staff, but other people that were volunteers, and the coverage was kind of iffy. So when we were able to get money to pay people to anchor the monitoring, it got very solid. After that study, we started working with people that had collision-prone buildings, and we wanted to use the knowledge that we had gained to try to help people with retrofits. So most of the work that we've done has been at Temple University here in Philadelphia and the University of Pennsylvania. And we've also built 2 centers here in Philly, Audubon has, and of course we try to make those bird-friendly buildings. And that work that was done at Temple was funded by their sustainability department. And at Penn has been just funded by, well, there was a student-led project that was funded by something called a Green Fund. So it's a fund that students can apply to do sustainable projects or environmentally sensitive projects at the university. And the project actually was about $25,000 to get some vinyl stripes on some collision-prone windows at a building in the medical school, and it required a 60-foot lift to get up to these windows. So the labor and the lift were a big part of the cost of that. But the subsequent work there has been funded by their basically Department of Real Estate Services. They take care of all the buildings on campus, and the landscape architect, the architect's office is all within that department, and they have been the ones funding that work. So this has been funded internally at both of these universities. Other work that we've done with people, we did work at a condo here in downtown Philly recently, and that was funded by the condo. The manager there was interested in doing something about collisions, and they bought this material. It's basically small vinyl rows of vinyl dots. That's one of the most popular ways of preventing collisions on homes and on commercial buildings. And they bought the material and their own staff installed it. So they did not get a professional company to install it. So the cost was really low. I forget how much it was, but it was like hundreds for this job, which was, a lot, like 8 windows, big windows on their first floor. I hope this sort of helps to get some information out there about solutions, but for residential situations for homes, these vinyl dots can be purchased from a company called Feather Friendly and also from Kaleidoscape. Those are the 2 main companies that have products of this type. And you can also get from Kaleidoscape perforated vinyl film. Adam was showing the pictures of the, the windows that were covered with that, with pretty pictures. You can use hanging cords every 4 inches or every 2 inches to sort of hang paracord in front of a window. And that can be a very easy solution for a home, not so much for a big commercial building. You can use markers that can make markings on glass, and you can make stripes and dots and whatever you want yourself. You can use tempera paint and paint pictures on glass, but you have to really have a dense pattern. You can't just put little decals on here and there and think that's going to stop birds from hitting it. So I know people wanted to get a little bit of that information. I hope that it's a little helpful in terms of that. I just want to acknowledge that we work in concert with other organizations in this space. And we're not the only act in town. And one of the major organizations that provides information about this also is the American Bird Conservancy. If you go to their website, you'll get lost because there's so much information there about all kinds of things, including some of the questions that people have about solutions. So I recommend that you take advantage of that. It's a very helpful website to use for solutions, commercial and residential.
Real quick, I'll be quick. To piggybacking off Keith, I completely agree with the products he mentioned. Those are the ones I often recommend: feather-friendly Kaleidoscape, Copian bird savers, or a do-it-yourself option at home, insect screens, all sorts of stuff like that. And I also will support Keith in that if you're looking at a non-residential installation at your nature center, your Audubon center, wherever it might be, the film is almost always the cheapest stuff. It's getting the people to do it or the equipment to do it if needed. But I've had some luck here in Atlanta. If you're working with a building that has like a facilities crew, maybe you can get them to do it, or hopefully they'll be open to allowing volunteers install it. If the windows are accessible, it's not rocket science. It's pretty doable. I've done it, and I wouldn't trust myself normally, but it's pretty easy to do. So just think about that. If you are someone who's thinking about putting a project together, make sure you don't overlook the other associated costs, because the film might only be a couple dollars a square foot, but the other costs can really add up.
Great. Thanks, guys. And I'm conscious of time. I know we want to get to our audience questions. We've got a lot of them. But before we turn to that, I want to talk a little bit about partnerships. You all have touched on that and the value of partnerships and how critical they've been for you all and the work that you've invested in. So, Kristen, you want to start to talk a little bit about any creative partnerships that have resulted as kind of through these efforts?
Yeah, and I actually did see a question about this come through as well, that we actually worked very, very closely with the American Institute of Architects Illinois chapter. They actually were the ones who reached out to us about interest in passing bird-friendly building legislation in Illinois. And I believe part of their story and why it became personally interesting to them to champion this cause was because their building, which is in Springfield, Illinois, had multiple bird collisions with their windows. I've been to their building. It's not a big building at all. It's a pretty small office building, maybe 2 or 3 floors. And over the course of a migration season, they had 3 birds that flew into their windows. And I think it really illustrates the point that this is happening in people's homes. This is happening in urban and suburban and rural areas. It really can happen anywhere because birds just can't see through. They can't really identify the glass. They either think that it continues, like their landscape continues beyond it, or they see the reflection on there. So they reached out to us and we worked really closely together on this bill. It was a really great partnership. We gave testimony together. We, rallied our memberships behind this bill. So they reached out to their architect members and we reached out to our Audubon members. And we actually, as I mentioned before, we co-hosted a webinar with them, which I think was really, really impactful. We were speaking to their architect audience and to the birding audience about this issue and why it matters in Illinois, why we're trying to pass this legislation. And we talked through, like I mentioned, we had Walker Glass there, which is a glass manufacturer that does bird, glass that has etchings on it and has some of that design in it so that it's visible to birds. And we were able to speak through the process of, what that looks like when you were developing a building. When do you need to loop them in? The answer is very early. We talked about the costs. Oftentimes incorporating bird-friendly design up front will be cheaper than retrofitting later. And so, we really demonstrates that we were able to demonstrate to architects in particular that it's not actually a burden, but it can be an asset, and it can be incorporated into the design of a building, into its aesthetics as well. So I thought that was a really, really cool way that we worked with the architect community on, something that they might not traditionally want to champion, but together we were able to pass this legislation.
Great story. Keith, do you want to talk about partnerships?
Sure. We have we've done a lot that over the years that's involved trying to educate our own members and so on about this. And Connie has been very intimately involved in this. And it's been wonderful work, but a lot of the other work that we've done, the monitoring work on retrofits, et cetera, lights out, it's big work. And it's all required doing work with in collaboration with a bunch of other people. And so that is really what has helped to get that other big work done. So I just, without going into detail, just say that if you have a university, if you have a bird club, if you have any type of outdoor enthusiasts, that band together, just be creative, try to find other people that you can work with if you want to really get something done about this in your community. I think it makes all the difference to have that, that capacity built by working together with other people than trying to do stuff for yourself. And also, I mentioned on a national level, another project that we were involved with was many years ago, LEED did not have, the Green Building Council's LEED to a building program did not have any credits about bird collisions. So they're building all these green buildings and they're killing all these birds. And we were actually able to successfully work with the American Bird Conservancy and some local architects that were in Philadelphia that were part of the LEED team that was evaluating new credits to get that pilot credit 55 on bird collision deterrence actually created. So that was really, I think, a really excellent thing, because all these buildings were being created that people thought were green, but they were killing all these birds. So that was a collaborative effort too. It's just another example of working with other people to get something done that you couldn't necessarily get done on your own. So these architects in Philly were involved with LEED already. They just needed information. American Bird Conservancy was very helpful in helping to get technical information about how this pilot credit should be done. So collaborations are really key in doing this type of work.
Great, thanks, Keith. I know you're still on.
Yeah, can you all still hear me? Is that okay? My camera just apparently an hour and 10 minutes was just enough for my camera. I can't get it to restart. But yeah, I'll kind of mention a few things. I mentioned the Georgia Tech policy course earlier. We've had a lot of luck with local universities. So Georgia State, which is right in downtown Atlanta, Kennesaw State in the north part of our metro area, Georgia Tech, and I've been able to even advise a few students at University of Georgia are all doing work. And there's also the Audubon University chapter program. So getting those students involved, I mean, they're often eager, there's built-in monitoring. I've had some success with professors offering extra credit to get students out. So great monitoring, and there's a nice research component. I mentioned Dr. Kyle Horton. That might not be that out of the box because he is an ornithologist, but he's allowed us to create some new education materials and engagement tools. Of course, we're working with local rehabbers because, as Keith mentioned, we do find a number of birds that are still living, so they need somewhere to go. And we've been able to help secure a little bit of funding to help their effort because they're always overworked with us and with others. And we've done some other cool things like locally produced videos that kind of highlight this issue and some of our other conservation work. We've had some success with local media. And similar to what Keith mentioned, it's the security guards and the cleaning people who know about this issue at buildings. And so they often partner with us. And we've had one really great building management company. We monitor a handful of buildings out in the kind of the suburbs that we couldn't walk around without their permission. They not only give us permission, but they have a system, they have a bucket. And anytime they do a sweep and find a bird, they save them for us in that bucket. We make sure to check every day so the birds are in good condition. And we get a much more accurate count of the birds that aren't making it past those buildings. So those are some of the partnerships that we have. And I know there are lots of others who have done great work with local artists to do unique window films and other applications. Some universities have done some great stuff. So again, with it being around our everyday lives and where we work and where we live, there's so many, I think, unique opportunities to approach this issue and look for different partners.
Great, thanks, Adam. So kind of turning to audience questions, you and Keith both mentioned injured birds, right? And how you all have been partnering with your local rehab, wildlife rehab clinics. So can you talk about what to do if you find a bird that is a victim of a window strike? Any of you?
Well, we originally were monitoring, and there was a big garden area in the area that we were monitoring in downtown Philly. And if we found an injured bird, we would move it to that area so that at least it would be off a sidewalk. It wouldn't be swept up or killed or whatever. And we would just hope for the best. But over the last year, we have actually recruited people to drive birds that we find injured to wildlife rehabilitation clinic. It's a complicated business. It's not for the faint of heart. You really have to be on your, P's and Q's every day to make sure that people are available and that they know where to go and that they're at the right time. But we've been able to take a lot of birds, and I think 80% of the birds we've taken were able to be released after that. So it's a good feeling to know that these birds were saved from awful fate. I remember being downtown this fall and finding a Virginia rail. It's just sort of on a sidewalk in downtown Philly. What would happen to that bird? You have no idea, but it was able to be rehabilitated. So there are a lot of injured birds that we find doing the monitoring. Anywhere from a quarter to a third of the birds we find are just injured. So now we're taking them to rehab. And I will say this, when the bred birds that, die from collisions are autopsied or whatever, basically they die from head trauma, brain injuries, etc. Some people might think they die from broken necks or broken wings or other internal injuries. And the dominant type of injury appears to be head trauma.
Yeah, so similar to Keith, we have a little document we've put together that we share with our more consistent committed volunteers. One thing that I always try to make sure people don't do is scare the bird right back into the window that it just hit. As you approach the bird, like Keith mentioned, many of them are pretty stunned and not heavily concussed and not in a great spot. So oftentimes it's actually pretty easy. You just walk up and the bird's unable or to move. So we have some details on how to approach it. We do have some nets that people can use to try to softly scoop up a bird if it's one that's still able to kind of get away from you. And the other big thing is, as Keith mentioned, the logistics of just getting the bird to the rehabber. We were unfortunate here in Atlanta. We had one great rehab center, but it was 40 minutes from downtown. So getting the birds out there was a real ordeal. So oftentimes it'd be a text to me and I'm putting an email out to our our most committed volunteers are putting it on Facebook, and we've almost always been able to find someone to do it. But I'm sure in Atlanta, just like Chicago and Philly and all these other places, driving across town is an issue at, 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. That's not going to be something that's always easy to do. So unfortunately, there are times, the reality of things, we go to a nearby park and let it go and cross our fingers, to be totally honest. In a perfect world, we get every bird to a rehabber, but that doesn't always happen. And as Keith mentioned, sometimes, it's internal injury. So sometimes the birds appear okay and they appear mobile and all that, and then they still don't make it. So we try to get every bird to a rehabber. We do have a new one that's opened up right in town that we use a lot more frequently now. But yeah, trying to approach the bird slowly from behind, not scaring it back into the window, using a net if possible. We show people how to use a bander's grip, where you kind of slowly putting the bird's head in between your index and middle finger. Putting in a dark, quiet place. We have brown paper bags that our volunteers carry with them. And then, get it to a rehabber if at all possible.
Great, thanks for that information. We have about less than 10 minutes to go with our scheduled time. And we do have a lot of questions still, but I know we've got a lot of questions focused on residential settings, and we've spent a lot of time talking about our urban settings. So let's switch gears and talk a bit about that. So here's a question: if there's a nature scene on the window, perforated vinyl, might that be problematic? Do folks need to consider the effects of particular images before they put those up?
So I'll go ahead, Keith. I don't have an answer. I mean, I have, that was something that came up, when we put up those complete coverage scenes, most of them aren't quite like a landscape view, but that did kind of cross our mind. At least at that building where we have some of like plants, we haven't detected any collisions on those buildings. But I could see, depending on what type of image you use, it's possible it could be confusing to a bird. So I would think about that. I also don't know. I mean, maybe you'd have the cool house and you put all sorts of images on your windows. I don't know how many residences or even nature centers would be open to that type of look that we did at that one building. So yeah, I don't know if there's data for that because it's such a limited approach, but I could see, if you had a layout of a meadow, it's possible a bird could confuse it. So if you did go with that complete coverage with an image, some thought would definitely be helpful. Go ahead, Keith, if you had something else to add.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate what Adam said. Just use common sense and don't create an image like the what's the Roadrunner cartoons, when they would draw these, deceptive, the coyote would draw these deceptive scenes on a boulder. I mean, if you do something like that, you're going to get maybe a problem. It should be something that's more fanciful or that birds aren't going to see as something confusing or deceptive.
In addition to that, kind of not to cut you off, but I mean, pretty much everything we've said applies to homes. So that paper that gives the best estimate of mortality, it also tried to tease out where these collisions are happening. And, over 40% is predicted to occur at your home. We mentioned some of the products, any way you can break up that reflection or reduce transparency, that see-through effect. I see a lot of questions about home lighting. I think there's more and more evidence now that it's not just downtown Philly or the Tribute lights in New York, it's everywhere. So down shielding your light, making sure it's going where you intend it to go, using motion sensors or just reducing what you can. It matters at your home too. It's not just these major urban centers, but most of the tactics we mentioned will work. I saw a few questions I think pop up about glass, and maybe Kristen knows more, but I do think that is still a bit of a hurdle, getting the bird-friendly glass that has ceramic frit or has acid etching for a home, but I could be wrong. I thought there needed to be some quantity in the glass purchase, but I'd be happy to be wrong about that if someone knows more.
I do not. I'm not sure, Nora. Keith, do you know?
Yeah, I don't really know. Someone asked, about glass manufacturers, and right now, people who supply windows for homes, whatever that you could buy at the hardware store, I don't think there's any product that is designed to prevent collisions. You have to be the person to create that situation yourself. So for a home, it could be quite expensive to go out and buy acid etched glass. It's a commercially available product though that you can obtain, but it would definitely cost you more to install that. So if you already have a home where you're having collisions, the problem can be dealt with much more simply by putting up these rows of vinyl dots on your windows or hanging cords, or doing something else innovative. It doesn't require putting in new glass. So
Yeah, and I'll
Who I
add
thought-
just,
Go
sorry.
on, Kristen. Go on,
Just
Kristen.
for lighting too as well, like it's as simple as just closing your shades or your blinds to not let the light out. I think even that's a very simple step that we can all do at night when we want to have lights on inside, but we don't want it to harm birds that are migrating at night. Just close those curtains up. And like they said, the downward facing lights that aren't just a light bulb shining into space, making sure it has some sort of shade over it so it's aimed downward. These are really simple steps that, I think have big impact. And I saw too, this isn't just during migration season. I think it can happen year round. And so, these things are tactics that you should try to implement if you can in your home, if you want to, all the time.
yeah, that's such a good point. You already have perhaps blinds, shades that can be drawn at night so that birds, and yes, birds do fly into windows on homes at night. You may never know if you don't hear the collision because some predator may or a scavenger may take the bird before you even know that it's there. But yes, they do. They do definitely do that. So drawing, blinds and shades or whatever, covering that window so at least the birds aren't seeing light coming from inside the building or seeing into the building is really a really helpful way of preventing these collisions happening. And I don't know if it has been said, I know Adam just talked about 40% of collisions happening on homes. When you add homes and low rises, 99% of all collisions happen on either homes or low rises. So that's where all the action is. It may only be a couple, you say it could be only be a couple birds in your house a year, but if you add up the millions and millions of homes that only have a couple birds a year, and a lot of homes have more than that, then you get to, billion, maybe. So, or near billion. So what happens on homes is very important.
Thank you. I think that's a really important note to take away, that it is happening everywhere, right? Including homes, and that's even more significant. We are out of time, unfortunately, and we will be circulating this recording to all those that have registered for this webinar. But I want to thank Keith, Kristen, and Adam, as well as our team behind the scenes, our social media team, our IT team, as well as John Roden, who's been working behind the scenes, and all of you for joining us this evening. And thank you for all that you're doing for the birds. So, good night.
Good night. Thank you. Sorry about the
Thank you.
camera.